Oh, hi, Mango. I just thought it would be a lovely day to be outside. You know, I think this is a good day to tell a story about Slenderman. Wouldn't you say so?
Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining me on this dark night. For tonight, Rose and I have brought you two wonderful tales about Slenderman. So sit back, relax while the window pops at us. And the first story is called The Giveaway, and it's written by Steve Rasnick-Tem. If you don't cut that out, something real bad's gonna happen to you. 6-year-old Marcia dropped the second handful of mud she was about to smear on 7-year-old Alice Kennedy's party dress. Like what? Alice made a thinking face for a little while. Well, I might tell your daddy about it, and he just might give you away. Marcia grunted. She proceeded to gather another handful of mud. Some of it spattered on her shoes, and she had to twist each foot just so to wipe them in the grass. It was hard to do that and still hold on to the slippery mud. Then she walked carefully over to where Alice was sitting making mud pies and raised both hands. "Stop it, Marcia! I told you what I'll do. I'll tell, and he'll just give you away." Marcia didn't understand why Alice didn't want her to smear mud on the dress anyway. It was nice and cool. And besides, Alice's dress was already muddy from making mud pies all afternoon. But she was even more confused about this giveaway stuff. She'd never heard of that before. "What do you mean, give me away?" "I'll tell him you've been real bad to me, Marcia, and he'll give you away to some other family, or even worse." Marcia just looked at her in confusion. "Moms and dads don't give their kids away," she said seriously. Alice looked up from her mud pie and smiled. "That's what your daddy did with your brother Billy." "That's not true, Alice Kennedy. Billy died and went to heaven." "How do you know? Did you see him go?" "Well, no, but Daddy told me he did." "They have to say that, stupid. They don't want you crying and making trouble." "Don't call me stupid." Marcia watched her shoes squishing into the mud. "Why did they give Billy away?" she asked softly. "I heard your daddy tell my daddy that Billy was too small and that he'd never be very big ever. He sounded real sad about that. So I guess he just gave him away so that he can get a bigger boy later on." Marcia nodded her head solemnly. "Know who else got given away?" "Who?" "Johnny Parker." "I remember him. He was like a grown-up, except he had something funny wrong with his head. Made him want to play with kids all the time. But he went to a special school. My aunt said so, and she's a teacher." "Well, he was gonna go to one of them schools, but they gave him away instead. Know who else?" "Shelley Cox. She kept breaking things and being mad and real mean. And one night her daddy had them take her away." "Who's them?" Alice looked over her shoulder at the back of her house. "I don't know for sure. Guess who else?" "Who?" "You, Marcia, 'cause you got my party dress all muddy, and my daddy's probably going to want to give me away for it, so I'm going to have to tell on you." "Tattletale!" Marcia cried, tears streaming down her face. Crybaby, Alice yelled, running towards her house. Marcia threw a handful of mud after Alice in frustration. She grunted as she began the long walk home. There were loud voices coming from the kitchen when Marcia got home. She could hear her mother crying and her father shouting. He sounded real mad. Marcia hated it when they had a fight. She sat down in a chair in the living room, picked up one of her books, and pretended to read. But she could only pretend because they were too loud. Can't you do anything so simple as enter a check properly, Jenny? I bet Marcia could do that, and she's only 6 years old. I'm sorry, Ted. I just forgot. Will you leave me alone? If I let you alone, we'd be broke within a month. Last week, you took out the grocery money twice and caused 6 checks to bounce. And you say you don't know what happened to the money. You're driving me crazy, Jenny. I can't take it. I tell you, I can't take it anymore. I've tried to be a good wife to you. Her mother started to cry and cough, and Marcia couldn't tell what she said anymore. She wanted to go in and see her mom, but she was too afraid. Her daddy was shouting louder than ever now. You haven't been a wife to me, Jenny, since Billy's been gone. Her mom was crying louder than before. Marcia could hardly understand her. The doctor says... You know the doctor said I can't have any more. You're lying, Jenny. You're lying through your teeth. I know that quack's nurse. You've been lying to me. Lying all the time. You just don't want to, Jenny. You just don't want to. Marcia went upstairs until dinner. She thought her daddy noticed the dried mud on her shoes when she got up from the table, but he didn't say anything. Marcia woke up with it still dark outside. Something told her she should go to the window. She was afraid because it was real dark out there, but she thought she should probably go. She tiptoed as softly as she could, afraid she might wake up her dad. A funny-looking car was parked out in the front of the house. It was long and black, the longest and blackest car she had ever seen. And there was a long silver thing, jagged like lightning, that went from one end of the car to the other. This lightning was brighter than the streetlights, and it hurt her eyes. The car windows were gray. They looked dirty. She couldn't see through them at all. Marcia didn't want to see the big black car anymore, but she was more afraid not to see it. She didn't know why she was more afraid of not seeing it, but she was. Marcia tiptoed down the stairs in her pajamas, scared to death that her father would catch her and maybe give her away like he had Billy. She went into the dark living room. The front door was wide open. She could see the long black car standing in front of the open door. She stepped carefully onto the sidewalk and started walking to the car. She tried to be as quiet as a mouse, like her aunt had told her once. She was scared of the car, but she had to keep walking toward it. She couldn't understand that at all. When she got to the side of the car, she held her hands up to her eyes and leaned against the window, trying to see what was inside. But it was too gray, too dirty, too dark. She started to walk around the front of the car and to the other side to look in the windows there, when the tall man stepped in front of her. He was tall, with black shadows all over him, and he had a big white bow tie and a big white flower on his chest. But she couldn't see his coat. He was so black. She didn't know how the flower stayed on. The tall man bent over. He had no face, just a head full of white fog, like his face hadn't made itself yet. Marcia began to cry in a soft voice. Scared to death she'd wake up her daddy, and he'd give her away for spoiling his sleep. But she couldn't help crying, and it kept getting louder and louder until she was sure that he'd wake up and want to give her away. Her pajamas felt suddenly wet and warm, and she knew she'd wet herself, and he'd want to give her away for that too. She turned around to run back to the house. Two men with no faces were standing there, carrying a long thing between them. Marcia was so surprised she stopped crying. For some reason, she wasn't so afraid now. So she walked up to the long thing that they were carrying to see what it was. Her mommy was tied to the thing, and she was looking up with her eyes all funny and her mouth open. And oh, she knew her mommy was dead. Oh, dead, dead, dead. She ran screaming into the house, and they grabbed her, and she was screaming, and they put something into her mouth. Only they was her daddy. He was sitting with her on the sofa now, looking all serious, like when she'd done something real bad. You saw the car? She nodded her head tearfully. Your mommy went away in the car. Yes. Her voice broke, and she cried a little. Okay, I want you to listen, Marcia. He held her chin up and made her look into his eyes. Your mommy didn't do things right, Marcia. She wasn't good enough. So you know what happened? Marcia nodded her head solemnly. I had to give your mommy away. That's what happens to people who mess up, Marcia. You've got to do your best. Do your best for me, all the time. Again, she nodded her head. But then her father was gone, as quickly as he'd arrived, and she was all alone on the couch in the darkened living room. She looked out the window, but there was nothing there. She knew everything was all over them. Marcia sleepily climbed off the sofa and stumbled around, trying to find a light switch. She couldn't find one, so she had to make her way to the kitchen in the dark. She would have cried then, but she really didn't feel like crying anymore. The kitchen light switch was too high, so she had to work in the dark. It was hard to find the pans or the turner in the dark, but she finally did. At least the refrigerator light let her see the eggs, and she kept the door open afterward so she could see better. She knew she'd better start her Getty's breakfast now, if she was going to get it finished on time. The stove and counters were real high for her, so it would take a long time for her to use them. Daddy liked big breakfasts, and more than anything else in the whole wide world, she wanted to please her daddy.
That was a good one. But I have one that will make you never want to go into the woods again. And it's called The Man in the Road. I sat quietly, sipping my glass of wine and wishing desperately that this evening would come to an end. Two of my friends, Brad and Lori, had been invited to a get-together with another friend of ours. He lived across the river in St. Louis, and we hardly got to see him. So when he invited us to a wine tasting he was hosting, we jumped at the chance, Brad being kind enough to give us a lift. The guests were mostly old friends of the host, and as such, shared many of his old war stories. Stories of his drunken youth filled with all manner and crazy stunts and funny events. I was sitting apart from the crowd because I had very little to offer to the conversation. My childhood, by contrast, was very tame, and I always felt a little embarrassed trying to compete. Something about these kind of gatherings always made me very self-conscious. But I was here to visit a friend, so I put on a brave face and tried to mingle with little success. Every conversation I tried to take part in was alien to me. Tours of duty in the military or one-night stands in drunken revelry. I mostly just stood amongst the group and listened, occasionally trying to add to the merriment, but only providing, if only in my own mind, how very much I didn't belong. I eventually ended up sitting by the glass sliding doors that led to the back porch. All around me, people were laughing and talking about old times and good friends now far away. And even though I longed to be a part of it, I couldn't work up the nerve. I sat quietly, sipping my wine, and waiting for the others to decide to go when the lights suddenly flickered and went out. A few people cursed at the sudden darkness, while our host fumbled for a flashlight. As I stood up to help him, my gaze turned to the sliding doors and to a dark figure just outside the fence. I lingered for a moment, just staring at him. He was standing just out of the light of the street lamps, which were flickering themselves. I couldn't make him out in the darkness, but I could tell that he was very tall, and he was facing the house. The figure stood perfectly still. As I watched him, and even though I knew I was just as hidden in the dark as he was, I felt like he was watching me. This entire event only lasted a few breaths, and as I turned to help find some form of light, the power kicked back on. I turned to look back towards the tall figure, but he was gone. Eventually, the party wound down, and the guests began to leave. Brad, Lori, and I lingered a little, and thanked our friend for a lovely evening before departing. I never did mention the strange figure to anyone that night. In hindsight, I wished desperately that I had. I sat in the back and talked to my friends as we started through the thick woods that led us to the highway. The road that passed through these woods had no streetlights. and the road itself was now very narrow. It was a wonder that there weren't more accidents on it. I was sitting in the back, talking to Brad, who was driving, and Laura in the passenger seat, when Brad suddenly yelled. The car swerved sharply, as Brad tried to avoid the tall man that had appeared from nothing in the road. As we screeched past him, he was illuminated for a brief moment. All I could make out as the car sped past was he was tall and wore a black suit, but could make no further details as the car started to roll. I can't recall how many times we rolled. I had slammed my head hard against the roof after our first roll, and then things became fuzzy after that. I do remember wishing I had buckled my seatbelt, and then sudden landing. The car made a sickening sound as it hit, the screaming sound of metal on pavement, and a thud as one of the occupants landed outside, thrown out during our violent accident. Sight returned to me slowly, and I found I was half out the window of the overturned car, but I could hear quiet sobbing somewhere in the dark. I looked around and saw the car, mostly whole, but many chunks had been torn free, almost like it had been gnawed by some terrible creature. I saw Brad lying on his back towards the front. His head was bleeding heavily, and his right arm was bent in an impossible angle. I couldn't tell if he was breathing or not. The dark woods hid everything beyond the wreck in an inky sheet of night. It may as well have been the void of space outside the dimming glow of the headlights. I tried to pull myself up to check on my friends, but the moment I tried to move, I saw pain. Not felt it, mind you. I saw it flash before my eyes in a spectrum of pale colors as I tried to move, even though the movement hurt. I lay in the road by the car for who knows how long. I was still half in the window trying to muster the strength to crawl out when I saw Brad move. At first I was relieved. He had to still be alive if he was moving. But the way he was moving wasn't right. He moved in short jerks, his body slowly turning until his feet were out of the beam of the headlights and pointing at the inky dark beyond. I lifted myself up as best as I could to try and make sense of what was happening. Brad's limp form jerked once, then twice, then like a bullet rocketed off in the darkness. The moment was so sudden, I questioned if I had seen it at all. I tried to move again, but was rewarded with those flashes of pain. I only managed to get out of the window and into the street. That's when I heard the crying grow louder and more urgent. At first, the crying was a tired kind of sob and not the bawling of a child, like a person who had been through too much suffering in a short time. Now it sounded frantic and panicked. I heard a brief scuffling out of sight on the other side of the car, and then silence. I held my breath, waiting for what I don't know, and after a few short seconds that stretched forever, the night air was pierced by a shrill cry. To call the stillness that followed silence would not have done it justice. This silence had weight to it, and I felt it on my chest as I looked around me and saw the light of the headlights growing dimmer. I noticed then that there was no sound at all, not even the sound of insects or the nocturnal animals of the woods. Something was near the wreck, hiding just out of the shrinking circle of light. Some unnatural thing that even the beast of the dark woods feared. Forgetting my pain, I started dragging my body closer to the front of the car. I had the insane notion I would be safe if I stayed in the light. Just as I reached the front of the car, a sudden and sharp pain shot through my head. It was so abrupt and intense that my vision blurred in one solid color. My vision cleared quickly, but the intense pain remained. As I looked around me, I noticed the headlights had dimmed even more in the short time. They were slowly going out, the dark void of the woods slowly moving in on me. It was then that I noticed a faint figure in the dim light. It was just enough in the shadows that I couldn't see it clearly, but it had the shape of a tall man. He stood perfectly still, just staring at me. At first, I had hoped he was there to help, some kind of passerby that saw the wreck. But the longer I looked at him, the more wrong he seemed. I could tell he was tall, unnaturally tall in fact, and his limbs seemed stretched and oddly proportioned for any normal human man. I tried to call out for help to him or anyone who may hear me. I can't remember. But the only sound I could manage was a rasp croak, in response to which he only tilted his head to one side. As soon as he tilted his head, the vision blurred. The vision blurring pain returned. Now more intense than before. My vision didn't clear completely this time, but still I noticed the men had gotten closer, only I couldn't recall him moving at all. He just seemed to appear closer to me in the brief moment I lost my sight. As he stood in the ever-failing light of the car, I could see him clearly now. He was clad in a dark suit, with a white shirt and red tie, which seemed even more surreal with his inhuman proportions. But as I was soon to learn, these were his tamest features. My gaze slowly rose to his face, and at first, I couldn't take it all in. My mind reeled at the sight of his face, or lack thereof. Where a face should be was a blank mass of flesh, and the vague shape of a human head, which was tilted slightly to one side, almost quizzically, as he looked down on me. Having seen the whole of him, I tried to scream, but I couldn't even muster a croak. Just then, the pain grew even more intense, and once again my vision blurred. As before, the tall man appeared closer to me, but never moved. He was right over me at this point. My vision stayed fuzzy around the edges, clearing at random now. As he stood over me, he began to twitch slightly, his faceless gaze never leaving me as the headlights flickered. Wispy dark shapes began to form around him, and I thought vaguely of smoke as the shapes turned into withering tendrils. The tall man quickly moved towards me, and the tendrils reached out as the headlights finally flickered out. As the inky black enveloped me, another sharp cry filled the dark woods. I had finally found my voice to scream. And that is The Man in the Road. Good night!